It says start recording. Okay, do you have a notification that says Youri's recording the call?
Yes, I do.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On the program tonight, we welcome back our returning champion and good friend to the program, Dimitri Lascaris, who's a Canadian-Greek independent journalist, environmentalist, eco-socialist, a social racial justice activist, and anti-imperialist campaigner. You know, all around the people power, a people power man. And the National Post would say he's a social justice warrior. To which I say, yeah, compliments. he's a member of Disruption Canada. He's a lawyer, and all around a true compassionate gentleman. He was a longtime Real News Network correspondent covering mostly Canadian topics in the climate crisis. And he's on to discuss a recent trip he made a while back in Russia. Before I begin, Dimitri, thank you so much for coming back on the program, especially while you're enjoying some much-needed downtime in your second home of Greece.
Thank you so much, Youri. Pleasure to talk to you as always.
Likewise, and so let's get to it because I understand that we're a bit strict for time. So my first question I wanted to ask you is, briefly your thoughts on Syria, because the Gulf actors have more or less stopped their military hostility towards Syria. They're no longer Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE are no longer funding right-wing Islamist death squads. Israel and Turkey, though, are still doing their military hostilities. But overall, I think it's safe to say that the Syrian government and the Syrian people have more or less won the war, although now they have the unfortunate, because the U.S. and its allies, Canada, Britain, France, and so forth, are still continuing economic terrorism and sanctions. But briefly, your thoughts on where Syria is, today, and any thoughts on the fact that Syria, remarkably, like the country of Vietnam, has overcome insurmountable odds and given a huge, black eye for the time being to Western imperialism, pan-European imperialism, and Gulf imperialism. So yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on all I've just said.
Well, I don't think you can really assess what's happening to Syria without looking at the larger geopolitical context. Syria doesn't exist in a vacuum, and what is happening there is really a rather remarkable example of a massive shift in geopolitical power that's happening before our very eyes. And just let me say before I get into the details of that, I mean, I do think that the Syria's government is a serious human rights violator. I do believe that there was serious opposition, and almost certainly continues to be fairly widespread opposition to the government of Bashar al-Assad within Syria and amongst Syria's expats. But he also has support.
Yeah. Continue.
There is a segment of the population. I don't think we're really in a good position to say what proportion of Syrians today support Bashar al-Assad, but he has support, and he also has opponents, and there are legitimate critiques to be made of his human rights record. Absolutely, that's true of just about every government in the Middle East, sadly. And if you look at, so for example, if you were to compare the government of Bashar al-Assad, his human rights record to that of, let's say, Saudi Arabia or Israel, right next door, I think you could make a pretty compelling case that these are much worse human rights violators, certainly no better than his government. And those are just two examples. I could give you other examples in the Middle East. And it's not because the peoples of the Middle East are incapable of governing themselves democratically. That's just nonsense.
Exactly.
Because we've supported regimes, that are grotesquely indifferent to the human rights of their constituents. And we've done that in the West because of oil, frankly. There's a massive amount of oil there. It's almost cliche to say it, but that's That is the reason why we've consistently supported governments that disregard the rights and interests of the peoples of the Middle East in deference to the agenda of the Anglo-American Empire. Anyways, with that preface, I think it's fair to say that if it hadn't been for the intervention of the Russian Federation, it's much likely that the government of Bashar al-Assad would have fallen. And I think it's fair to say as well that attempts to overthrow Assad's government are a miserable failure and ultimately caused far more suffering to the Syrian people than they would have suffered, that they would have sustained if they had just been left to their own devices to try to, improve the governance conditions within their country without external interference. This has been a terrible catastrophe for the Syrian people. It has not in any way, shape, or form enhanced their well-being, improved the democratic conditions within the country, because that was never the intention. That was not the intention. The intention was to overthrow Assad and to put in place somebody who was going to do the bidding of the Anglo-American Empire. That project failed, and I think it had a lot to do with Russia. And now you wrote both Russia and China quite clearly, the level of influence that they enjoy within the Middle East is outstripping that of the United States. And, another example of this, of course, is the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Exactly. Thank God that sectarian Cold War is finally done.
Absolutely. And it was that the violence and the division and the hostility that those two governments directed at each other was very much a product of a strategy of divide and conquer pursued by the United States and its Western allies. This now has opened up a possibility of the resolution of the catastrophic and genocidal war in Yemen, which we have fueled. We in the West, our governments have fueled. This has opened up a possibility. You mentioned the case of Turkey and its relations with Syria, although that's a much more complicated project and they're some distance away from a rapprochement. There are talks ongoing. And now that Erdogan has won the election and doesn't have to be distracted by, his domestic opposition for the time being, I think we're likely going to see some progress on that front. And that's going to leave the United States quite isolated to a degree in the Middle East that it's not been in the post-World War II period. And it'll be really interesting to see what's going to happen to that force of American soldiers who are illegally occupying a part of Syria and stealing its and stealing its oil, and preventing. I understand that area includes some of the most productive agricultural land in Syria, not just the majority of its oil reserves. And this, of course, is this is naked theft that's happening to the detriment of the Syrian people, whose interests we were supposedly trying to advance. So this is really, at the end of the day, part and parcel of a much larger shift in geopolitical power towards Russia and China and away from the United States and its Western allies or vassals.
Here's hoping that the Syrian government can overcome that thorny issue of Turkey being a thorn in their side. And actually, the next time I have you on, I want to talk to you about Greek history and, of course, its relations with Turkey. But we're going to save that for another time. On to Russia. And the Ukraine-Russia-NATO war, because you were there recently, and you're going to be doing a nationwide Canadian peace peace tour, talking to people about your experience in Russia, how we can end the ongoing tragedy that is the Ukraine-Russia-NATO war. But let's talk about your time in Russia. Describe to our audience what the mood was like in Russia. How are the people faring? Because whatever criticisms and opposition one might have regarding Russia's military action in Ukraine, I simply can't support the really extreme, over-the-top sanctions and cultural boycott of Russia. And I was wondering, what impacts can you see visibly that the sanctions have had on the largely Russian working class and precarious middle class? And what have people you've spoken to said about the extreme boycott sanctions placed on their country?
So it's important. I have to, at the outset, articulate a disclaimer. I was in Russia for 1 month. I was not. I spent a total of 18 days in Moscow. I did not see any, significant Russian city outside of Moscow. I took a train from Moscow to Crimea, which was, I did see a significant part of the country from the train. It was a 28-hour train ride. I took it all the way to Simferopol, which is the capital of Crimea, and I spent about 10 or 11 days in Crimea. There I went all over the place when I was in Crimea. So, all I can relate to you in response to your question, Youri, is what I saw and heard with my own eyes. And obviously, there's a hell of a lot of the country that I did not see. But what I saw was there was no indication of economic crisis at all, none whatsoever.
Interesting.
People, all the shelves in the grocery stores, the department stores were fully stocked. Anything that you might want was readily available. I was quite surprised, at least as someone who was spending US dollars. I had to go there. I couldn't use any credit cards. All my credit cards have been issued by Western banks or bank cards, so I had to go there with cash. And basically, there were only two types of currency that they would accept at the institutions that were converting currency, and those were US dollars and euros, right? So, but I went in stores to the extent I could shop on the limited funds I had with me. I didn't have trouble getting anything, and everything seemed to be quite reasonably priced. I was actually amazed at how inexpensive things were. Like, I would go into restaurant in downtown Moscow. It wasn't like, a Michelin guide restaurant, anything like that, but it was a reasonably nice restaurant. And I was buying meals, same types of meals I would be having in Montreal, in Athens, in, Toronto, at half the price of what I would pay, approximately half the price of what I would pay in those cities for a meal of comparable quality.
Interesting.
So, and it's just walking down the streets. I must have walked, in the time that I was in Moscow, well over 120 kilometers all over the city. I didn't see any signs of stress. I saw less visibly homeless people.
Which we're going to get into. Which I definitely want to talk to you about because that was quite interesting. But yes, continue.
And the one thing that did stand out for me, this was something it wasn't really, I wouldn't call it in any way, shape, or form a sign of economic stress, was that you could tell that there had been, large Western corporations that had a presence there and that they'd left recently. So, like McDonald's, you could tell it was a McDonald's restaurant, but it was no longer called McDonald's. And one of the places I saw.
Rick Sterling, who's been on the program, told me that the Starbucks is now just called Stars with a little bit of a Russian twist to it.
Look, we're all over Moscow, And then there was this, this sort of old, famous, beautiful department store at Red Square. I think it's called Gum, if I'm not mistaken. I went in there a couple of times, and they had some, just to walk around and see it because it's an architectural marvel. And there were a number of luxury brands there, and the stores were closed, and so for example, there was a Chanel store.
Yeah.
And there was a little sign that had been put in the window where they indicated that they were closed for the time being. They didn't state explicitly that they had completely abandoned Russia, but they had shut down. But people in Russia are getting by just fine without Chanel. I think it's fair to say. And there were other luxury brands like that, like Hugo Boss, whatever. So those were the only signs that I saw of any kind of economic duress. I wouldn't even call that economic duress because at the end of the day, you don't need to have corporations like Starbucks and McDonald's and Chanel in your country in order to be well off.
So that's actually a perfect segue then to this question, which is if the economic sanctions and much of the Western-led boycotts, aren't having too much of a negative impact on Russia, then what has been the remedy counterforce to that?
You mean how have they dealt with the sanctions?
Yes. So if the economy isn't screaming because of all the Western-led boycotts and cultural boycotts, and the Russian people seem to be doing okay, what do you think is the reason behind that, or what did you find out was the reason of all of that?
Well, I think that the number one reason. I don't know. I don't know if I want to say the number one reason, but obviously a huge part of the reason why Russia has coped so well with these extraordinarily intrusive sanctions, which were obviously meant, I think, all you just have to go by statements of Western leaders. They were meant to destroy the Russian economy. There was that infamous remark by, Biden that the ruble is rubble. No, it's not, Mr. Biden. It's not even close to being rubble. And in fact, it strengthened for some period of time. And now I think it's trading roughly around the level it was just before the invasion. It has to do with the fact that most of the world has not imposed sanctions on Russia. It's as simple as that. We don't talk about this in Canada or Greece, but, countries that have very extensive economic ties even with the West have not imposed sanctions. The one that really stands out for me as a Canadian is Mexico, because Mexico is a member of the three-country, free trade arrangement that governs North America, which used to be called NAFTA, the North American Trade Agreement. And they've refused. They refused to impose sanctions. Of course, the most obvious and important cases are China and India, which are massive economies. By purchasing power parity, China has the largest economy in the world. And it's very easy for Russia to reorient its trade towards those countries because it shares a border with them.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to rely upon maritime transport. There's really effectively no way, at least in physical terms, that the West can interfere with trade or impede trade between Russia and India and Russia and China because they share a border.
Interesting.
And also their economies are so large that, trying to punish them as well would just cause like a global depression. If the West were to react by the determination of these large economies to continue doing business with Russia by trying to impose sanctions on them, I think, we'd be plunged into a global depression. And I think as crazy as the people are who are running the West, at some level, they understand this. And of course, it's not just China and India. Africa, most of Africa has not. Of course, the BRICS, Brazil, South Africa, they are not imposing any sanctions on Russia. So we in the West, and this is something that I intend to talk about when I go on this tour that's being sponsored by peace groups, we are actually in the minority. We like to call ourselves the international community, as if we speak for humanity.
Exactly.
But if you look at most of I would say, probably the governments of the world that have refused to sanction Russia probably represent somewhere in the range of 75 to 80% of the human population.
So wait a minute, Dimitri, are you saying to me that the West, that Western Europe and our Eastern European client states and the United States and Britain and Canada and Australia, New Zealand, that's not the international community? The world really doesn't revolve around us?
Well, we can pretend that it is, but, which is what we do in the West. But unfortunately, reality has caught up with us.
Exactly.
We can just tell each other our own little bubble, hey, we're the international community until the cows come home. But the reality is that sanctions have failed because that's just, a laughable fiction. And I think that the West is now having to come to grips with this. We don't speak for humanity.
Exactly. And that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, were you able to talk to individual Russians or folks who are members of groups that are opposed to the war in Ukraine, who, even if they do think that Russia is in the right, they simply believe that the war shouldn't have been an option due to the kind of backlash it would produce? Economic sanctions, the West really closing the doors, and the Cold War getting even more colder. And before you answer that, a frequent guest on this program, Małgorzata Kubaczeska-Figet of Cross Border Talks, a very brilliant Polish independent journalist, she was telling me that there were feminist groups and other small peace groups who are trying to speak out on the war. And she mentioned to me that the conscription of Russian soldiers, mostly men, was very discriminatory, and it's mostly minorities and marginalized Russian folks who are being sent, and they don't want to fight the war. And some of them have been trying to engage in draft dodging. And yeah, I'm curious your response to that before I ask another question about Russia's military actions in Ukraine.
Look, I know that there are opponents out there. I personally did not hear anybody express opposition to the Russian Federation's military intervention in Ukraine. And by the way, it's important to understand what the polls are showing in Russia. There's a polling agency by the name of Levada. Anybody can check this out. It's E, V as in Victor, A, D as in David, A. You can Just enter that word, Levada, and Putin, and approval rating, and up will pop the historical approval ratings from Vladimir Putin from the time he first became the president of the Russian Federation up until this day. This agency is well known for its hostility, this polling agency, to the Vladimir Putin. And it has been routinely cited by Western media over the years as a reputable polling agency. So this isn't some kind of, illegitimate polling firm. And what they'll show is that the current approval rating for the government of Vladimir Putin is in excess of 80%. And historically, I don't believe there's ever been a time it was below 60%. It might have dipped slightly below 60% years ago. But his approval rating, according to this, I think it's fair to say anti-Putin polling agency has historically been well above what you typically see for leaders of Western countries. And right now it's sky high. So the fact is, of those polls, there's no reason for me to doubt the accuracy of those polls. It's not easy to find people who are opposed to the war in Russia, in Ukraine, who are opposed to the military intervention in Ukraine. That doesn't mean they want war. That doesn't mean that, they wouldn't prefer to see a negotiated resolution of this. But all indications are that the vast majority of Russians living in Russia today support the government's policies with respect to Ukraine. I did try to speak to one person. Unfortunately, we never actually met, who's a communist. His name is Boris Kargalitsky, who is a implacable critic of the Russian government, and who in fact wrote an article recently that was published in Canadian Dimension in which he expressed the wish to see the Russian Federation defeated in the war in Ukraine because he felt that this was the best hope the country had to rid itself of the government of Vladimir Putin. So I tried to speak, we just couldn't connect. I didn't go out looking for people who were supportive of Russia's per se. I didn't go out looking for people, generally speaking, who were opponents of Russia. But everybody I spoke to in person, everybody whom I actually met, it's not deny what your guest told you. I'm sure there are groups out there who feel the way she recounted. I have no doubt that that's true. But the people that I met and actually spoke to in person, no one expressed opposition to the Russian government's policies. And if anything, if they were critical, and some of them were, it was criticism from, shall we say, a hawkish perspective. Their view, and I heard this quite a bit, even though they were overall supportive of the government of Vladimir Putin, their view was that the government was not being aggressive enough in prosecuting this war, in defeating Ukraine, in defeating the Ukrainian government, not the people of Ukraine. It's important to say that their hostility was directed not at Ukraine's per se. It was directed at a government in Kiev which they view as being illegitimate and acting in ways that are profoundly contrary to the interests of the Ukrainian people. So they thought, the government was being too cautious. They also thought that the Russian government should have intervened years ago. They complained that it had waited so long because, and I understand their perspective on this back, around 2015, 2016, just after the US and the EU orchestrated a coup in Ukraine, the Ukrainian military was extraordinarily weak. And it would have been a much less bloody affair to defeat that military. But over the course of the, intervening 8 years, they were trained, tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops were trained to NATO standards. Large amounts of NATO weaponry were imported into the country. Ukrainian soldiers were trained with that weaponry. Extensive fortifications were constructed in eastern Ukraine near the line of contact. And so the task of defeating the Ukrainian military has become much harder over those 8 years. So that was a criticism I heard a fair bit. The government should have acted sooner.
Interesting. And I wanted your response to this claim that Malgorzata said that, and she said that while some in the anti-imperialist movement and the anti-NATO camp do think that Russia and Eastern Ukrainians do have legitimate grievances and concerns regarding NATO expansion, Western meddling in Ukrainian affairs, which has led to this terrible situation. But she was saying from her research in dealing with the Ukrainian community in Poland, those from both East Ukraine and West Ukraine who had to flee. She said that Russia's invasion has only been counterproductive, not only because it's only further inflamed Russophobia and anti-Russia attitudes, but most of the targets of Russia, the collateral damage Russia has done mostly in the East, these are the people that the Russians claim they are trying to help. But when the Russians target a gas station or target electricity supplies or even water, that affects people's livelihoods, including when they, bomb a shopping mall or a center, and that's only intensified the Banderite movement, the Nazi movement, and more broadly only inflamed anti-Russia attitudes, since when innocent lives get lost, those folks then fall prey to those movements, to those very movements that the Russians claim they're trying to vanquish. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I those are some fairly sweeping claims, which are plausible.
Okay.
On their face, they have a certain. When I say plausible, I want to be clear what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that I heard this from people, in Russia. That's not what I heard. But again, I didn't conduct any kind of scientific polling, and I'm not aware of any polling that's been done within the territories that Russia now controls, which support what your guest told you. Okay, there may well be polling evidence of which I'm not aware, but I haven't seen it. I'm just saying.
And I'll also just briefly mention, I know somebody from Ukraine, from Kharkiv, which was the place where the Russians first invaded. She lost a family member under the age of 5, and we've not had a big discussion on who's to blame for this entire tragedy. But I think if I was a betting man, she definitely hates the Russian government and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and so forth. So I just wanted to mention that when we talk about Russia's military actions being counterproductive and only further inflaming pro-NATO and pro-Zelensky views and and the Banderite movement. So I'm curious. Yeah. So continue on with what you were saying. Sorry for interrupting.
No problem. So I mean, so what I said plausible is plausible because war is hell. War is a terrible thing, and there's no question that a tremendous amount of suffering has been occasioned by this war. However, the people that I spoke to from the parts of Ukraine. Remember, I spent 11 days in Crimea, and I was all over Crimea. I spoke to dozens and dozens of people in Crimea, which is part of the war zone. There have been attacks, although it's not nearly as damaged by the war as, let's say, Donetsk is, or Luhansk. But I also spoke from people from Luhansk and Donetsk. I interviewed, for example, I'm just about to publish an article. I interviewed a professor of math at a Moscow university who comes from a village or town that's right next to the city of Donetsk. It's literally a few kilometers from the front line. His mother lives there. His older brother lives there. He has extended family members who live there. And we spent, an hour and a half talking. As I say, I'm going to publish the remarks that he made. And he was entirely supportive of the Russian government, and he felt that the Russian government is protecting his family. That if the Russian government had not intervened militarily, he said to me that in the days leading up to the invasion in February of last year, he knows people personally who somehow were permitted to travel across the line of contact prior to the invasion because they had family members or maybe they had business interests on the Ukrainian side. And that they reported seeing a massive buildup of military forces by the Ukrainian army just on near the line of contact in the areas controlled by Ukraine. And one of the things that they also noticed was that the type of weaponry that was being transported to the front line was new. It was weaponry that they had not seen previously. And he also reported, and this has been supported by, I believe the data from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that there was a massive increase in shelling from the Ukrainian side into the Russian-controlled side in the days leading up to the invasion. And so has there been tremendous suffering as a result of this war? Yes, but his perspective and the perspective of other people, the perspective of his family members, other people I spoke to from this area, is that the Russian government actually intervened and stopped them from being steamrolled by the Ukrainian military and then being forced to live under a regime which they see as, first of all, illegitimate, and secondly, Russophobic, intensely hostile to Russia. So they see the war as a necessary evil. They don't want the war, they want it to end, but they saw it as a necessary evil, that the alternative was worse. So there are definitely people, I'm sure, I wouldn't doubt for 1 second, who would have preferred, even people who are Russian speakers, people who have family members in Russia. I would be shocked if there aren't people like that living in Ukraine who oppose the invasion and would have preferred that it not happen at all. But there are also people who support it. And as I said, I'm not aware of any polling evidence which really can give us any reliable way of estimating which of these groups is larger. At the end of the day, there are conflicting views on the ground about all of this. And as I've said repeatedly, Youri, rather than have debates about obviously it's very important for us to understand why this war happened and to allocate responsibility and hold the wrongdoers accountable. But our number one priority should be to bring the war to an end, not to escalate it, to bring it to an end. And whatever one may think of the Russian government's intervention, I don't think that any rational, objective person could say that it didn't have any legitimate complaints prior to this, and that it didn't try to address its complaints in a nonviolent manner. Okay, so sorry, go ahead. I'll stop.
Well, actually, that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is, I want your thoughts on this when it comes to the long-term outcome of this, again, this very, very, unfortunate war conflict. Now, my colleague and friend Bojan Stanislavski, of the founding editor and co-editor of The Barricade, an independent pan-Eastern European news outlet that covers Eastern European and international affairs through a critical left perspective, on his YouTube program a couple of times, and the last program I did with them last year during the Christmas holidays, Bojan believes that Ukraine will simply be partitioned into 2 or 3 countries. So Western Ukraine, which will include Kiev, that'll be its own country aligned with the West, NATO, EU. Eastern Ukraine, the region, Donbass, the regions that you mentioned, Donetsk and Luhansk, one will secede and join the Russian Federation. The other, like Crimea, will hold a referendum and either join the Russian Federation or be its own country, which has nothing, which wants nothing to do with the rest of what'll be Western Ukraine. And that region will largely be recognized, or these 2 regions will be largely recognized as independent states or part of Russia, and they'll be recognized by Russia and the real international community, which is Latin America, Africa, China, much of Asia, but not recognized by the US, EU, and NATO members. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's very difficult. This is a plausible scenario that you've described, that your guests described. I think it's very difficult to say at this stage what exactly the ultimate landscape will look like when the violence stops, and hopefully that'll be very soon. But there's a few things we can say with a very, very high level of confidence at this stage, at least if you're in touch with reality, which, unfortunately not many people in the halls of power in the West are. And one of the things we can say with a very high level of confidence is Crimea is never going back to Ukraine. That just ain't, certainly not in our lifetimes. It's not, and everybody I spoke to there wanted Crimea to be part of Russia, and their feeling about the Ukrainian government was even stronger. Whatever the fate of Crimea may be, they want nothing to do with that government. And I just think there's absolutely no way. I'm not a military expert. There's absolutely no way that Crimea could be retaken by force. We can get into that if you want, but you don't have to take my word for it. I mean, military experts and pro-Ukraine Westerners in positions of power and influence have acknowledged that it's unlikely that Ukraine is going to retake Crimea by force. So it ain't going back. I think that's a virtual guarantee. I think it's also at this stage a virtual certainty that the Donbass and Luhansk, although I'm not quite as sure about this as I am with respect to Crimea, that they won't go back to Ukraine, and they probably will be part of the Russian Federation, either de jure or at a minimum de facto, for many years to come. Would they potentially, after all the dust is settled, emerge as independent states? That's possible, but I think that, again, although I wasn't there, but everything that I saw suggests to me that the vast majority of the people who are currently living in those 2 oblasts want to be part of Russia. And frankly, if they aren't part of Russia, it's very difficult to see how they could be rebuilt.
Yeah.
Where I'm less confident in making a prediction is with respect to the oblasts of Kherson and Zaporozhye, which are to the north of Crimea and to the west of Luhansk and Donetsk. There, I think, not based on anything that I personally saw or heard, but based on my understanding of the histories of these areas and accounts that I've read of persons who are from these areas, I think the level of support for Russia is significantly lower than it is in Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And maybe the Russian Federation, which controls most but not all of those two oblasts, would be prepared to cede control over them under certain circumstances if its other concerns were adequately addressed. So I think that is unclear. I think the other, after that, I don't think there's much that we can say with a lot of confidence. The borders of Ukraine are going to be redrawn, no doubt about it. And
unfortunate, and I think that's unfortunate. But if that is the case, then the blame for all of that is not Russia's military invasion, which was that's just much more fuel on the fire. But it goes back to we have to blame Western meddling, Western imperialism in Ukraine, for that. And I think,
Youri,
yes, go ahead.
You said that's unfortunate. I don't know if. I think it's premature from my perspective to say whether it's unfortunate or not fortunate. So first of all, the borders are redrawn all the time. The borders of countries have been redrawn countless times in modern history, and going back centuries even more so. They're not sacrosanct. They're not written in stone. They're not eternal. The borders of no country are immutable, and in circumstances where it would benefit the populations that are affected for a border to be redrawn, we shouldn't stand in the way. To me, whether or not this ultimately is unfortunate will depend on whether or not the will of the people who are affected by the redrawing of the border is being respected. If it's consistent with what they want, so for example, if we had internationally supervised plebiscites that both the Ukrainian government and the Russian government were committed to respecting, and those plebiscites showed majority support for the redrawing of some parts of Ukraine's border, I don't know why we would say that's unfortunate. Why is that unfortunate? There's nothing magical about a border. If it's done in a way that is to the benefit of the people who are being who are affected by the redrawing of the border, and it's consistent with the will of the majority of the persons who are affected, we should embrace it. If it brings about peace, stability, and ultimately leads to more harmony in the region, I don't think that's unfortunate at all.
And that's a perfect segue then to this question. This is actually my second to last question, which is: do you think Russia could have tried a peaceful option with Ukraine? Lula, the president of Brazil, in the press conference, he said that there needs to be exhaustive diplomatic solutions to the conflict. He said both Zelensky and Putin don't talk of peace. Both need to start, however difficult, dialogue to end this conflict. He found both parties at fault and said the U.S. and its allies need to stop escalating the conflict by sending arms to Ukraine. And then there are some anti-imperialist voices and anti-war groups who share both of our perspective on how this tragic situation unfolded, and do largely think NATO and the West is to blame for this. But some of those voices also argue that this is an inter-imperialist conflict, and I wanted your thoughts on that, because some of the views of the Russians you spoke to, one talked about erasing Ukraine. Some have talked about not just liberating Ukrainians of a Russian background in the East, which I understand, but they said that even the concept of Ukraine should be eliminated. Jeff Cohen, the founder of FAIR, leading U.S. Media critic and part of Roots Action, said on this program that if you listen to Putin's speech when he announced the special military operations, he spoke of Russia as a neo-Tsarist country and spoke of a greater Russia. And the recent follow-up documentary to Ukraine on Fire, great documentary produced by Oliver Stone, Putin in an interview did subtly talk of Ukraine simply being absorbed in the Russian Federation. So given that, is there some truth that this is an inter-imperialist conflict? And if not, explain why you reject that thesis.
I think really it depends on what you mean by inter-imperialist conflict.
Two rival capitalists, two rival imperialist countries duking it out over Ukraine.
Well, there's no question that the Russian Federation, I don't think the Russian Federation tries to hide this, and I don't know why it should, that they had very, very serious concerns about NATO expansion into Ukraine. Now, you can say until you're blue in the face that Ukraine is a sovereign nation and it had a right to be a member of any military alliance that it wanted to, and I would agree with that. But it's also true that the members of NATO made commitments to the government of the final government of the USSR, Gorbachev, not to expand NATO eastward, and it was, I think, entirely legitimate that Gorbachev would seek such assurances, and they violated the assurances repeatedly. Under the NATO treaty, no country can accede to the military alliance unless all the members of the alliance agree. So when you say, Ukraine is a sovereign state, they had a right to join NATO, they didn't actually have a right to join NATO. No country outside of NATO has a right to join NATO. NATO has a right to say no, and any particular member of NATO can veto the entry of another country into NATO. And that's, in fact, what effectively Erdogan has been doing with respect to Sweden. We're seeing this in real time, right? So did Russia say, hold on a second, this is a threat to our security. You've put missile launchers in Poland and Romania, which are capable of hosting nuclear-tipped Tomahawk missiles. And
also, when Putin tried to give an olive branch to the United States, saying, "Hey, we're no longer enemies anymore. Why don't we join? Why doesn't my country join NATO?" And he was given the cold shoulder by crooked, slick Willie Bill Clinton. But yeah, continue on with what you're saying.
And absolutely, and by the way, I understand. I don't know whether this is historically accurate, but I understand that Putin actually warned Bush that if Ukraine joined NATO, that Russia was going to seize Crimea. This is people geopolitical analysts who understand this region, they get why Crimea is so important, because Crimea gives Russia a warm water port. Whoever controls Crimea, as I was told by one person, a military expert in Crimea, effectively controls the Black Sea. It is an area of strategic importance to Russia. So there's no question, Youri, that Russia's government was largely, but not exclusively, motivated when it invaded Ukraine by security concerns and by the possibility that Russia would be threatened, and the possibility that ultimately it would be subjected to a potentially devastating nuclear first strike if it allowed this to happen. Does that mean that is that imperialist? I don't know any country, if it had the ability to put a stop to that threat, to nullify that threat, that wouldn't think very seriously about nullifying that threat, if necessary, by military means. And even if you call it imperialist, to compare it to the acts of imperialism of the United States, like I got into a debate with some right-wing journalist who interviewed me while I was in Russia.
Yes, Adam Ziva of the National Burnt Toast.
Right, and he said, well, isn't this exactly the same as Iraq? You've criticized Iraq. And I said, no, this is nonsense. Iraq is not on the border of the United States. And furthermore, not only is it not on the border of the United States, but there weren't millions of Americans living in Iraq who were being bombarded by the Iraqi government at the time. And furthermore, there were no assurances given that Iraq wasn't going to join some military alliance, which were then violated by the alliance. There's nothing like that. So, depending on your definition of imperialism, you could perhaps characterize what Russia has done as imperialistic, but is it of the same nature or scale of the acts of imperialism of the United States? Not even close. Not even close. So I think that people in the anti-imperialist community, this is an important discussion to have. It's a legitimate debate, but let's be real and look at the historical differences. This is not the same thing as Iraq. And to say that it is just to ignore abundant historical evidence to the contrary.
And we're almost out of time. Can I squeeze one last question though out of you?
Sure.
Then, you already talked about Crimea, and well, I'll just say this: I really do hope that there will be peace in Ukraine. There's going to, whatever legitimate grievances Ukrainians had towards Russia, whatever legitimate grievances Russia had towards Ukraine, and within Ukraine society itself from the West and the East, I really do hope. Well, the war needs to end, but I think don't expect the politicians to fix this. That's going to be whatever reconciliation needs to be had between Ukrainians and Russians. I think that's only going to happen through people-to-people contact. But the sooner this war ends, the better. And I'll just say, Russia out of Ukraine, but NATO out of existence. How's that for an answer? So very briefly then, Dimitri, because I don't want to keep you too over time because you have your other appointments to get to. Talk about talk about when you were studying and speaking to people who help out the homeless in Russia, the homeless situation in Russia, and I'm curious your thoughts on that. And are any of the advocates for the homeless that you spoke to, do have any of them said that Putin and whoever comes in power after him, that there needs to be more socialism, and they've recognized the limitations of fiscal conservatism with Russian characteristics? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
So, as I mentioned, I was struck by how fewer visible homeless, and I stress the word visible homeless, I saw in central Moscow, despite spending many hours walking around the city. But I was also, I sat on the board of a homeless shelter in London, Ontario in Canada for 10 years.
Yeah, that was interesting. I didn't know that. We're definitely going to have to talk about that also in the future.
And I learned a few things about homelessness. And one of them is that, a lot of people that you don't think when you see them on the street are homeless, in fact, are homeless. So just, the classic case of somebody who's homeless is somebody, the ones we immediately recognize as being homeless are people who are sitting down on a sidewalk and they've got a cup in front of them and they're begging for money, and they look like they've worn the same clothes for a week and they haven't showered in a week, and it's clear to anybody who can look at them that they probably don't have a home. Okay, but a lot of homeless don't look that way, and so despite what I saw, I decided to go to a homeless shelter in Moscow, which is operated by an organization that calls itself the largest charity in Russia, servicing the homeless people of Russia. And I spoke to the director there, and you can see the interview, watch the interview.
Great interview, by the way, yeah.
Thank you. So it's DimitriLascaris.org. And the director said to me that according to a recent survey, and in fact, that there hadn't really been numbers on the extent of homelessness in Russia up until very recently, that something in the range of 1.3% of the population of Russia, so you're talking about, I think, maybe 2 million people out of a population of 140, 150 million people, maybe a little more than that, are either homeless or near homeless. So that doesn't mean they're actually living in the street. It means that they're basically one lost paycheck away from losing their accommodation from their residence, and a lot of these people kind of drift in and out of homelessness. Yeah. So they'll be there for a few weeks or a few months homeless, and then they have a home, and so they're kind of on the edge of homelessness. So these aren't people who are kind of permanently entrenched in the category of homelessness, and that's a big number. And in fact, I'll tell you straight up, I think any number of homeless people is a big number.
Exactly.
So this is absolutely unacceptable in any society. I've said this repeatedly about Canada. I'm shocked at what I see in the streets of Canadian cities every day. It's absolutely appalling. I also will say, and I said this in my interview with this young lady who was kind enough to give me her time and explain talk about the situation of homelessness in Russia, that homelessness is a feature. It's a feature, not a bug of capitalism. And what what I mean by that, I think that the way you get people to accept substandard compensation, wages, and substandard working conditions is to terrorize them into accepting them. How do you do that? You have an underclass of people who live in the streets and they see them every day and they got, but for the grace of God, go I, or whatever the phrase may be. And it acts as, a kind of, incentive on the working class to accept, unfair conditions of labor. So I think it's actually by design that we have homelessness in capitalist societies, and I don't think Russia is an exception to that.
Exactly.
And she went on and she said, I asked her at the end of my interview, if you could, give the Russian government a prescription for how to deal with this problem, what would you say? And she's like, went on and on and on. First of all, you have to stop stigmatizing people. You have to put much more money into dealing with homelessness. You have to improve the conditions of labor. And she talked about some specific labor practice in Russia. I can't recall exactly how she described it, Youri, but it was something that was a bit unusual, and it wasn't something that I had encountered in the West before. And she said this has to be specifically abolished. So there has to be better regulation to prevent these types of practices. So there's no question that the Russian government could do a much better job on the level of homelessness. I don't know. I don't think I have enough information to say whether the situation in Russia is worse or better than it is in the West. But I will tell you that based on what I saw, Russia is not as bad as it is in the West. I mean, like even my hometown, a city of 400,000 people in Canada. When I was a kid growing up there, Youri, my son lives there, so I go back there regularly. When I was a kid growing up there, I almost never saw homeless people. Now I see them everywhere.
Wow.
And this is in one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
I think it also just goes to show because I think the reason why there is so much why there's such high approval ratings for Putin also goes to the fact that when Russians look back at the USSR and they compare the USSR to the 90s, which was their decade of humiliation, that was their civilizational downgrade. While for them, Putin has done a lot to reverse the worst elements of uber capitalism that that Yeltsin and the West imposed on them by he gave single payer healthcare back, and so. But he still practices fiscal conservatism, and as long as you mentioned, as long as you have that system of capitalism, you're always going to have haves and have-nots and homelessness, which I think any society that allows homelessness to exist and not combat it, that is a crime against that is a crime against humanity.
It's a massive failure. And also, as I've argued many times, we shouldn't have billionaires. Russia has billionaires. I criticize that. I criticize it in the West. But the thing, and what's interesting, Youri, is that if anything, I think if you're looking objectively at the situation in Russia, the oligarchy, and there is an oligarchy, has less power now than it did in the 1990s.
Exactly.
Putin threw in jail the richest man in Russia. He was the 16th wealthiest man in the world, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And then when he did that, he tossed his ass in jail. The man was basically a kleptocrat and ruthlessly exploited the opportunities for corruption and theft of state assets that arose under the Yeltsin government. He put him in jail, and we in the West started talking about him as though he's a political prisoner. I mean, it's ludicrous.
The same goes for that American crook, Bill Browder, who gave up his nationality to basically become a Russian, to loot Russia. And again, Alexei Navalny, guys, he's also a right winger, and he's no left, not even a liberal alternative to Putin. But all righty, but just before I let you go, Dimitri, remind people about this nationwide tour you're going to be doing in Canada when you're back.
So I've been invited by peace groups from across the country to
like Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, amongst the
They're taking the lead, and there's various peace groups in other cities in the country, and it's going to take place during the last I think 11 days of June. And the plan right now is I'm going to speak in just about every major Canadian city at some stage during that 11-day period. And I want to start a conversation. I can't stress this enough, Youri. I've committed a tremendous amount of time and energy to the subject of the Ukraine war because I want it to end. And I don't want it to end by means of a defeat by one side and a victory by the other. I think that's an extremely dangerous thing for us to pursue. The total defeat
agree with you.
We could easily find ourselves in a nuclear war if this continues. I want the parties like Lula, I want Putin and Zelensky to sit down at the table, or their representatives, and hammer out a mutually acceptable compromise. And so my purpose in agreeing to do this is first and foremost to have a conversation with the people of Canada about how we can best facilitate a dialogue with the Russian people, what a peace deal might look like, what are the points of negotiation which need to be discussed and addressed, and how do we enhance people-to-people contact, because at the end of the day, if we leave this up to the leaders of our countries in the West, this thing is going to end in the destruction of that country. That's where this is headed.
I completely agree with you. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program. I hope that's I hope to have the chance to have you back on the program. Until then, you enjoy the rest of your time in Greece. I wish I was in Canada so I could see this tour of yours, but don't worry. We'll have our audience get Youri to come move to Canada thing, but that's another topic for another day. Until then, Dimitri, thank you so much for your time and all my best. And keep doing the brilliant work you're doing. Keep doing the brilliant work you're doing. You're an inspiration to us all. And if you're pissing off the national burnt toast, trust me, you're doing a good thing. It's a badge of honor.
Thanks a lot, Youri. Take care.
Take care. Take care as well.